Chris, Yaniv, you guys will know, the reason that the best CEOs are the best CEOs are because they make better decisions, maybe only 10% more of the time, but making better decisions 10% more of the time has an outsized asymmetrical feedback into your business. So we're not talking about some airy-fairy nonsense here. We're talking about, on a practical level, shifting from making shit decisions because you're making them from a place of fear and lack, to ideally shifting your brain to making decisions from the part of your brain that is actually designed to make decisions. This is a practical application in your life.
You're listening to the Startup Podcast. This is an educational episode, in-depth masterclasses about the concepts essential to building, running, and investing in Silicon Valley-style startups. Whether you're a founder, investor, or operator in a startup, you'll gain insights into the principles that power high-growth disruption, the same way Facebook, Google, and Uber do it. The conversation starts now.
Hey, I'm Chris Todd.
Hey, I'm Mike Scott.
And I'm Yaniv Bernstein. And in today's episode, we're going to talk about the topic of imposter syndrome. Now, I suffer from imposter syndrome. Chris, I know you suffer from imposter syndrome. We also have a fantastic guest, Mike Scott, who talks about his own journey with imposter syndrome. This is something that so many founders deal with, and they often deal with it alone and without any clear strategies. So in today's episode, this is a really meaningful one for us, where we talk about the challenges of imposter syndrome, what it is, why it's so common in founders, ways in which it's holding you back, why success, that thing that you hope will cure imposter syndrome, will do no such thing. It will only make it worse. And finally, lots of tactical advice on practical ways that you can, in fact, deal with imposter syndrome and the anxiety that comes along with that, so you can build an incredible startup while living a good life. All that and more coming up right after the break. Whether you're starting or scaling your company's security program, demonstrating top-notch security practices and establishing trust is more important than ever. Vanta automates compliance for SOC 2, ISO 27001, and more, saving you time and money while helping you build customer trust. Plus, you can streamline security reviews by automating questionnaires and demonstrating your security posture with a customer-facing trust center, all powered by Vanta AI. And it gets even better. Just for TSP listeners, you can get $1,000 off Vanta when you go to vanta.com/TSP. That's vanta.com/TSP for the Startup Podcast to get $1,000 off. There's the stuff you need to do to grow your startup, and there's everything else. HR, IT, payroll, expenses, and more. Rippling handles everything in that second bucket, no matter where in the world your employees are. There's no such thing as a silver bullet, but Rippling kind of is one. No wonder they're growing so fast. Get your first 3 months free by visiting rippling.com/TSP. That's rippling.com/TSP for the Startup Podcast. Just before we get started, we need to talk about the Startup Podcast Pact. We have been doing this for nearly 150 episodes. We have put in an incredible amount of work making the Startup Podcast. So we only ask a tiny little thing in return for all of that value we give. That is the Startup Podcast Pact. In order to help the podcast grow, please subscribe to us in your listening app and on YouTube, and share us with your network. That makes us so happy. It makes a huge difference to the future of this podcast. Really appreciate it. Today's guest is a friend of the pod and a friend of mine. Mike Scott has had a really successful career in tech. He was the founder of a digital agency called Nona Digital, which was sold to their biggest client because they were doing such a great job, which was African unicorn Yoko. Mike is a really great speaker. He actually has a podcast of his own called How to Be Moderately Successful, which I think maybe is actually, even the title of that is a great introduction to this topic and the challenges of imposter syndrome. So Mike, welcome to the show.
Thanks, guys. Good to be here again.
Mike, I think for this one, we really want to have a fairly personal and vulnerable conversation about the topic of imposter syndrome. So it would be great to hear a little bit about your journey through life and business and where imposter syndrome has reared its head up for you.
So my story is quite unusual. I didn't go to university. I started my first business when I was 15 at school. And actually, I think that's on reflection where this whole thing started. So technically, I didn't start my first business at 15. Technically, and I'm being a bit silly here, it was an acquisition. It was an acquisition that probably cost about $400 for the business, but it was still an acquisition. And the acquisition was from my cousin. My cousin has gone on to become one of the most successful people that I know, period. And if I reflect back on this, even in like year 11 when I started this business, right from that point, there was this feeling of like, Jesus, I'm not going to live up to this. I'm going to get found out. The minute I get found out, this is all going to come crashing down. And that hasn't left. It's just got more zeros on the end and the stakes have gotten bigger. But that sense of like, when they find out that I don't know what the hell I'm doing, it's all going to come crashing down. Fast forward 21 years, I'm still waiting for them to find out that I don't know what I'm doing.
Today's the day, Mike.
Today's the day. It's just, very unconventional background, sort of entrepreneur from when I could walk. Started first real business at 15. That business I ended up selling about 17 years later. Then started Nona Digital with 4 other friends, essentially, co-founders. And then that business was acquired in 2021, 2022 for a kind of off-the-charts multiple of EBITDA, especially for a services business. And we had extreme success, actually, through that business. Yet what's interesting about that is, as an entrepreneur or a founder listening to this podcast, the dream, the goal, pretty much usually is to build, grow, if you're a startup, scale, and exit. That's the game. Like, you win when you do this. Yet we did this, and we did it very successfully, like off the charts successfully from a services business perspective. And yet the experience for me was pretty terrible from an emotional perspective, not a financial perspective. And post-exit, my imposter syndrome cut off the charts. Like, I can't draw any logic to it. And I do a lot of work with this now. It's been 2 years of really, really deep work with this stuff. And I think I'm, let's say, in a good place with it. But it's just a really interesting reflection that I go through this thing, sort of quote unquote, we win, we achieve the thing that everyone tries to achieve. And yet still, despite as much evidence as anyone could ever want, that is objective evidence, the sense of imposter syndrome, the sense of like, but if they really understood, they wouldn't have done it. But if they really knew what was going on, hasn't disappeared.
I think each of us on the pod have gone through this, and probably most people listening with any sort of ambition or rational view of the world have felt this to one degree or another. Myself, I've been building companies and consulting with companies since I was probably 15, 16, 17. My dad actually introduced me to some of his clients from Telstra, which is a big telco here in Australia, to advise them on web strategy and help them out. These are like larger industry associations, like the Hotel Association or the Restaurants Association. And there's these rooms of 40, 50, 60, 70-year-old men, typically, and women, who are all looking at me at the head of the table while I have my own anxiety and panic attack issues, which I've talked about on the show, feeling like, why are any of these people listening to me? And this is a bit of a strange situation. And for me, I think it's worse. It was a mix of like, I know what the hell I'm talking about, and yeah, they should be listening and they need to update their worldview, and oh my God, am I the right one to be saying this? And I remember talking to my eng manager at Uber, who had been there quite a number of months before I joined and kind of knew what was going on and had come from the Googles of the world and worked in these sort of companies before. In the first week or two, when we were getting to know each other and kind of sniffing each other out, the thing that really broke the facade or broke the ice, if you will, was us both admitting to each other that we had a huge amount of imposter syndrome, that we'd been hired into, at the time, what we felt was one of the most important companies in the world. It was one of the fastest growing companies in history. We thought it was making a real dent in the universe. And we were like, wait, they just handed us the keys to this entire developer platform? Are we even qualified for this? I remember just finally having a conversation with one of the business development leaders who would work closely with us because the developer platform was closely tied to partnerships. We were talking about South by Southwest and what activation should we do at South by Southwest. And I said to him, this was very early on in my stint there, like, hey, that's a great idea that we both came up with. Who would approve such a thing? And he looked at me very confused and said, you would? I was like, oh yeah, right. That would be me. It's a pervasive thing, I think, for many founders. And, we're going to talk about why in a few moments. But yeah, I think definitely gone through that personally and persistently throughout my career.
My story, I think, in some ways is similar. I finished my bachelor's degree right in the height of the tech wreck. And between my, at the time, very poor interview skills and the real lack of jobs available, I just didn't get a job. And so I decided to do a PhD. In fact, it's quite interesting. It turns out the number of students enrolling to PhDs has a very strong inverse correlation with the unemployment rate. So it is actually a bunch of people who have trouble getting jobs going, oh, well, I'll just stick around. So much for that noble impulse. And, I did the PhD and I think I already had some imposter syndrome around that because it seemed like my work wasn't very important, but it was supposed to be this sort of big thing, the way it's presented. And then I got the job at Google, and I think, Chris, similar to you with Uber, it felt like they must have made a hiring mistake. And it was only going to be a matter of time before they realized their mistake. And I think, that's one of the things with being surrounded by really smart people, but also achieving something that seems very difficult, especially when there's an external gatekeeper, like getting a job, right? Is like, oh, okay, if I've gotten this very desirable job, there must be a mistake because they must think I'm really something special and I know I'm not really. That happened every time I got promoted, it hit again. And then when I left Google and kind of became an executive, right? I still feel uncomfortable using that term because it feels like executives are people who are sort of smarter and more assured than me. And then again, as a founder, so sort of nearly every time I did something, and as a founder, we were able to raise a lot of money. We got into Y Combinator, ticking a lot of these boxes, all of them just made it worse. And, even now on this podcast, guys, I have strangers reaching out to me sometimes saying, I love what you do. It helps so much. I could really use some of your wisdom. And I'm like, oh, well, what wisdom? It can feel that way. And you can hold two things at the same time. Sometimes it's the upper level brain and then your more primitive brain. I know I'm good at some shit. I know my stuff. I wouldn't do the podcast if I didn't think what we were saying was a good product. But at some level, a deeper level, I think it can be hard. So yeah, I think that's my story, and we can come back to the whys and the ways in which it comes back. But I think one thing that's come through so strongly in our story, all three of us, is this observation that success does not cure imposter syndrome. I'd love for us all to dig into the why. Why is it that imposter syndrome seems to be so common in founders and other folks who are building their own businesses?
I think that, the first thing we have to touch on here is that what founders are doing is actually just hard. We talked in a recent episode about the idea of other than maybe cancer and running the world and let's say losing a child or a loved one, in terms of your professional life, building and running a startup is probably one of the hardest things you can possibly do. And so it's no wonder that the people doing that feel just objectively out of their depth. And I think that's where we got to start. You're choosing to do something very, very hard. And it's no wonder that you feel like you're not qualified.
I think just to build on what Chris is saying, building a startup, it is an exceptionally difficult thing to do. You are signing up to do something that probably will fail statistically. That is exceptionally difficult. And I think the psychology of it is almost by definition, you don't know if it's going to work. You're essentially trying to prove that something is going to work. And I think, I remember on my previous podcast where I was only interviewing founders of very, very successful, generally fintechs. One of my favorite guests was a really successful woman who has achieved massive success in her tech platform. She's got a PhD in something unrelated. She's Forbes, whatever, recognized woman of the world. She's an amazing, amazing woman. One of the questions I asked her was what are some of the attributes that you think founders absolutely have to have? And I would ask that of most guests, and I'd usually get the usual answers: grit, determination, whatever. She was like, I think the most important thing is a healthy dose of naivety. And I was like, what? What do you mean? And she said, honestly, to build a startup, if you really know what you're getting in for, you probably won't do it. And she's like, I think my naivety, Mike, was the thing that actually got me to the point of validation. And I think there's an interesting thing there around the psychology. So just to sort of round it out, to answer your question, I think it's what Chris said right up front. I think that founders, especially in the tech space of startups, have got so much imposter syndrome because what they're doing is exceptionally difficult. They're choosing a path that is of most resistance, that is the highest likelihood of failing. And they're going into it kind of knowing, you guys will know the stats, but what is it? 1 in 100 is going to succeed. And that sort of starts a cyclical process in the brain going, well, why am I better than the other 99 really smart guys and girls that are trying to do this? Why am I different? Without seeing the validation.
I'm liking this because I think I wanted to actually talk about what I call the generalist issue. And my observation is that these things really tie quite closely together. So we talked about how building a startup is hard, but there's a specific way in which it's hard, which is that as a founder, you're an extreme generalist, right? Everything that goes into running a business, from finance to people to tech to legal to raising capital to PR, everything comes down on your shoulders, especially in the early days, right? It is literally impossible to be good at all those things. You know what they say, a jack of all trades is a master of none, but it's even worse than that because when you first become a founder, you are unlikely to be a jack of all trades. You'll know some of those things pretty well and you'll be absolutely shit at some of them, right? You'll have no fucking clue. You might not know anything about finance, right? You're not a trained accountant. You've always worked at big companies, whatever. You don't know how to do finance. And yet, guess what? It's on you. And so I think this is one of those things where it's like, oh, okay, everything's on me. And therefore, what might seem like a reasonable expectation is that I am at least competent at all those things. But no, you are literally putting yourself in a situation where you'll be incompetent at some things that are important to running your business. You're going to have to learn it on the job. You're going to have to minimize the blast radius of all the things that can go wrong when you do those things that you are incompetent at. And you're going to have to hope that it works out. But that really eats away, or has the potential to really eat away at you, right? To have to be responsible for things. You have this business you care about a lot, and you're responsible for something that you know you are bad at, and you have to just kind of go ahead and do it anyway. So I think one of the reasons you get the imposter syndrome is because in some real sense, you are being an imposter at part of your job, but you just have to go ahead and do it anyway. Like, yes, it's hard, but it's hard in that way that exposes nearly by definition, large areas of incompetence in you that you just have to deal with.
You're also trying to distort reality and fake it till you make it, in some ways pretending that you're competent at something that you or your company is not. This is objectively hard. You're a generalist trying to do very specific things, and you're trying to distort reality and fake it until you make it. And the thing that all three of these have in common is you're actually incompetent. Imposter syndrome, which is sometimes thought of as a psychological effect. You're not really an imposter, but actually the reality of these first three reasons that you're experiencing quote unquote imposter syndrome is that you are to some degree an imposter. You are not as competent or necessarily the only or best qualified person to be doing the thing that you are trying to do. And your company is not yet successful at the thing it's claiming to be able to solve. It's really almost these first three reasons that founders experience a lot of imposter syndrome are that they're maybe psychologically healthy. They are actually expressing a healthy form of self-reflection, but doing it anyway, which is a kind of bravery, I think. You know, bravery, as they say, is not the absence of fear. It is the feeling the fear and doing it anyway. We've talked in the past on this show about how startups are magical and they defy gravity to some degree. I don't know that we've ever spoken about being a founder as an act of bravery, and I think that that's a really important aspect to the story and why I think we could all claim that we love startups so much. It's magic performed by brave people.
100%. I remember when we were really working hard with our positioning, the single thing that had the biggest impact on our business, we were working with a guy who wasn't enormously helpful, but he had one line that really shifted it for me. And he said, Mike, I want you to stop thinking about positioning as a process of strategy, and you need to start thinking about positioning as a process of courage. And it just flicked a switch in my brain, and I was like, okay, got it. Didn't fix it overnight, but I was like, I get the resistance now. I'm scared. I'm scared to try these other things. I'm scared to do that. What if it fails? And he's like, it's an act of courage. It just shifted a switch in my brain. And I think everything in founder life is an act of courage. Everything. Pitching is an act of courage because you can get basic human desire. You can get shut down. You can feel like you're not enough. You can be rejected. Hiring people that are fantastic and not having them go to Google but come to your business is an act of courage. Everything you're doing is an act of courage.
I think, we talk a lot on this show, and I talk a lot in my advisory work about not hedging and having conviction. And I rarely describe it in terms of bravery. And so I think we've hit on something in today's conversation already. To reduce hedging and to have conviction requires bravery. Not the absence of fear, not the abundance of information and clarity, but actually a little of excess bravery to give something a try and commit to it, knowing you could be wrong. In fact, the probabilities are that you are wrong, but you do not want to live in zombie mode, splitting the difference, time slicing, and getting nowhere fast.
It makes me think, you guys would have probably spoken about this concept, but just in case some of the listeners haven't heard it, there's a guy called Vivek Murthy, who's the US Surgeon General, wrote a book called Togetherness. And in that book, even though it's a study on loneliness, the thing I took out of the book was his framework. This is a very smart human being and a very self-aware human being, but his decision-making framework was really helpful to me. And he speaks about revolving door decisions and one-way door decisions.
This is actually, Jeff Bezos loves this. I don't know if he invented it, but he popularized it, certainly. Talks about it a lot.
Yeah, maybe Jeff does also not. So let me go through it quickly, and then I'll give you the insight that I got from Vivek Murthy, is that one-way door decisions are what they say on the tin. Once you go through them, you can't come back. Those decisions, you should agonize, take your time, get as much information, really slow down and make your decisions. Revolving door decisions, you shouldn't overthink them, and you should treat them as experiments more than decisions. Like, we can do this, if it doesn't work, we come back. Now, the kicker for me was that his insight was not so much the revolving door decision concept and the one-way door decision concept, but he said that we spend most of our lives in the middle. We don't take enough time on the one-way door decisions, and we spend too much time on the revolving door decisions. But to me, that's a factor of courage, because it's safer for us to sort of sit in the middle. And you talk about conviction. I speak to my clients about this concept of strong opinions loosely held. Have deep conviction, but the way that we communicate that conviction is, hey guys, with the information that I have, with the environment currently, this is where we're going. If that changes, we will change, rather than being flippant or being arrogant in your decision making.
Or being tied up in circles and wrought with indecision, being frozen and unable to move, right?
Yeah, and that's usually a factor of courage. Like, if I look at myself, when I'm unable to make a decision, there's a thing in my life at the moment on sort of, let's call it the investment part of my world, where I'm a bit stuck. And if I'm really honest, I don't really need more information. It's a courage thing. It's like I have a lack of conviction because I'm scared to do something. And what's the result? Like, I'm probably not making a great decision right now because of that.
Now, of course, perhaps one of the last reasons founders experience this imposter syndrome a lot is that founders tend to be type A personalities who have really high expectations on themselves. Maybe they have a chip on their shoulder, maybe they have something to prove, maybe they have a vivid vision that they're trying to create in the world. While the first 3 or 4 things we discussed are legitimate reasons for imposter syndrome because you are actually out of your depth. This last one is maybe just over-exaggerating, over-inflating, catastrophizing in your own mind just who you need to be and how good you need to be, when actually you're absolutely good enough or no better than everybody else in the same situation. And you have this kind of exaggerated sense of how good you need to be for that moment in time or that thing you're trying to do.
I would go through periods in the business where I would feel like I've sort of run out of talent. I'd look at myself and go, hey, look, we were not a massive business. We were not an Uber or anything even close. But we would have these sort of step change growing up stages in the business, which every business will go through, startup or let's call it traditional business. And I would have these like crises of confidence where I'd be like, shit, am I still the guy to lead this business? And in the earlier days, that would just send me into a spiral, destructive headspace thing that wasn't particularly useful. But over time, I started actually asking the question. So not just a rhetorical question. I started going, okay, well, am I the right guy to lead this business? And I actually started doing this really interesting, well, for me, it was very interesting and useful process where I would go, what does the perfect person look like to lead this business right now? And I would call that person Mike version 2. So I'd go Mike 2.0, who's this person? And I would write down the attributes and the capabilities and the skills of this person objectively. And I found that quite easy, actually. So there's a famous story, which I won't go into. You guys will know this, but with Andy Grove and how what actually catalyzed the shift from memory to microprocessors, you'll know this, where very short story, they went, what would the best CEO in the world do? And then it was like, we should do that. What would the perfect version of Mike do? This other dude, this other guy. Write down those capabilities, write down those skills, write down those attributes. Then have a look at Mike's current version. Write down those skills, those attributes. Now you can create a delta between my current version and what Mike should look like to be able to run this business. And 9 times out of 10, for me, it took away a lot of the fear because I was like, oh shit, that delta is actually not that ridiculous. There's 1 or 2 things that I really need to get better at. Let me go get better at those things. With an open mind that at some point, that delta would have been too big. And that's the point at which you go and find somebody much better than you to actually do the thing. That's not imposter syndrome. That's being real about your capability limitations. That process or a version of it was extremely helpful to de-emotionalize it and actually bring some sort of conversation into it.
When we talk about high self-expectations and chip on your shoulder, one thing I wanted to say is before this topic, we were talking about courage. And again, I wanted to join the dots between all of these because I think not all founders, but a lot of folks in this space are high achievers. And there is a sense of an insecurity or a self-doubt that we are trying to resolve. And I think, where the dysfunction sits here is it's kind of like, well, by achieving more, we hope that we'll be able to fill that hole. And so, we were talking before about this, that success does not cure imposter syndrome. I nearly think of it as like someone who is afraid of heights. And so they want to prove to themselves that they're not afraid of heights by climbing another rung on a ladder. But every time they climb a rung, they're higher up. They're not actually curing the fear of heights. They're trying to prove to themselves they're not afraid, but they are. And in proving it to themselves, they get higher and higher and higher, and they become more and more afraid. And so I think, that's one of the things here. And I can't remember who said it, but coming back to that notion of courage is you probably shouldn't be a founder unless you have no other choice. So I'm not sure I would consider it courage. It's nearly compulsion is a word that I would use, right? There are a lot of easier ways to live your life. And Mike, even earlier on, you said that, you're taking the path of most resistance. What sort of crazy person takes the path of most resistance? It's a person for whom all the other paths have become non-viable for some reason. So tying all these things together, why is imposter syndrome so common in founders? It's because it is really hard. It is because we are often trying to fill a hole in ourselves and we're doing it in this way. It is because we're going to be incompetent at so many of the things we do. And it is because what we're trying to do is so uncertain. And you tie all those things together and you're like, of course you're not going to feel like you're going to be successful here. Right? And of course, that imposter syndrome is not going to get better as we gradually do build some success.
I think I know what you're saying there, but I want to challenge something just for clarity purpose. You said you're doing this because you don't have a choice. You absolutely do have a choice. I think it's a really important point. Like, you always have a choice. If you're choosing to do this founder thing, there's a self-awareness that I think is really important to come along with that. For me, this is very closely linked to our identity. Like, what do I mean by identity? Like, our identity is the sum of the stories we tell ourselves because of our past experiences and our future projections, okay? So by definition, it's created. This is where people go wrong. They're like, oh, but my identity, Mike, I can't shift my identity because it's who I am. Like, bullshit. Your identity is the sum of you telling yourself a whole lot of stories and a whole lot of things. It's not real. Your experience of it is real, but it's created. This imposter syndrome, and the assumption here that I'm talking about now is that the imposter syndrome is to the far right of the spectrum, and it's actually a negative and unhealthy thing in your life, right? So this is the premise I'm talking on now. That's an identity that you've assumed. You've assumed that I am not good enough for this thing, or I am going to break this thing, or I am going to get found out, or what have you. Those are just stories that we are telling ourselves, right? I think it's a prompt for what is a very healthy process, which is to actively and intentionally see the opportunity to shift that identity. Because imposter syndrome is part of us just assuming an identity. For me, it was and still is like, I'm actually going to get found out. I actually don't know what I'm doing here. I'm out of my depth. I'll never be good at this. That is just a set of stories. And I think it's an amazing prompt that if you're listening to this and you're a founder or just a human and you experience imposter syndrome, when you're aware of that imposter syndrome, that's a gift to self-reflect and go, what's the story I'm telling myself right here? You might be listening to this and going, what the hell are we doing talking about stories that we're telling ourselves? I want to know about how to build a startup and get 100x valuation. This has got everything to do with running a great business. Your state of mind, your capability as a founder, it's got everything to do with the decisions you're going to be making in your business.
Over the last 2 days, intensely, and over the last 2 weeks, generally, I've been talking about how everything is a narrative. And you need to preface pretty much every declarative statement you make with, I have a story about this. I have a story
100%
that I'd like to tell. I was talking to an old friend of mine who was challenging me on this and like stopping at certain layers and going, well, yeah, this is a story, but that's not a story. And then there are stories and then there are values, right, Chris? And I'm like, no, I think you have a story that you have values, and then your values create yet more stories. It's all just stories all the way down. Like, yeah, sure, you have cancer. That's real. The ground is under your foot. But most of what happens over the top of that, what that means and who you are in the face of it and what you're going to do next and who you are and who you are in the face of it, this is all just stories. Well, a country you're in, its founding stories, its etiquette, morals, ethics, just all of it. It's stories. And there's the guy who wrote Sapiens. I'm not going to be able to pronounce his name or remember it.
Yuval Noah Harari.
That's what I said. Yes, exactly.
Yeah.
Thank you. You know, he talks about all of these wars. They're not about resources. They're about stories. There is plenty of resources to go around. And so absolutely at the core of this, I agree so much, Mike, is the story you're telling yourself, about others, and about the place you are in your journey. I think if you don't understand the power of storytelling and you're in the startup game, or if you're deriding the power of storytelling, listening to this, and wondering, hey, why are these guys wasting my time with this? Then you are really missing a trick. Startups are almost entirely about storytelling, and about signaling and about telling a story to your investors and to your employees and into your customers. So we should have an entire episode on storytelling, in fact.
100%, Chris. And I want to make it really practical for the listeners here, like practical. So your current state of reality is the story you're telling yourself. Like it is, right? I'm not going to try and unpack that. I'm not a qualified psychologist, but go there if you want to go there. How does this relate to startup world or founder world or leader world? You know, I'm not going to get into the brain chemistry and the brain anatomy, but basically what's happening is when we feel deep imposter syndrome, the sensation we're generally going to be feeling is fear. That's generally how it's going to manifest. It's fear of being found out. It's fear of failure. It's fear of embarrassment. It's fear of all of these things, right? If you're listening to this and you're having a visceral response in your body, that's fear. When we are in a state of fear, the lowest functioning part of our brain, called the amygdala, takes over. It's really good at punching people in the face and running away, right? That's why we call it the fight or flight. That's what takes over. That is a terrible, terrible part of your brain to make decisions with. When we can shift that feeling of fear, generally to a sense of gratitude, we are literally changing the part of your brain that is firing up. We're changing it from a stupid reptilian part of our brain to the highest functioning decision-making part of our brain. So practically speaking, what we're talking about here, guys, is the ability to make good decisions. Chris, Yaniv, you guys will know the reason that the best CEOs are the best CEOs are because they make better decisions, maybe only 10% more of the time, but making better decisions 10% more of the time has an outsized asymmetrical feedback into your business. So we're not talking about some airy-fairy nonsense here. We're talking about, on a practical level, shifting from making shit decisions because you're making them from a place of fear and lack to ideally shifting your brain to making decisions from the part of your brain that is actually designed to make decisions. This is a practical application in your life.
I think that's such a valuable point, Mike. Like if you think about a high-performance athlete, their physical strength, their physical conditioning is the core of what they do. And so, of course, they pay attention to their health and to their body and to their diet. And yet, as a founder, your mind and fundamentally your ability to make good decisions and tell good stories, as we've been talking about, that is at the core of what you do. And to neglect the health of your mind is to neglect your job, apart from anything else, apart from all of the other reasons why you would want to work on yourself. It is part of your job to work on yourself, which is why, Chris, we've done a number of these episodes of the podcast on mental health, partly because we care about you and you should care about yourself. But it's part of the fucking job. You got to be in peak operating condition. And that is really about your mind.
In previous episodes on mental health, we've talked about this need to build the thing that builds the thing that builds the thing. The third tier up, which is you. You are the thing that builds the thing, which is the company, which builds the thing, which are the products and services. This is, at cause, as some say, the root of the thing that you need to pay attention to.
You know what founders hate? All that back office busy work that goes into operating a company. I'm talking about HR, onboarding, offboarding, payroll, EOR, LMS, IT. The list seems endless. And for each of these things, you have a separate vendor, a separate invoice, a bunch of integration headaches. No more. Rippling is doing something miraculous. Building a single all-in-one workforce platform for your global workforce. A single vendor, fully integrated for all your HR and IT needs. So you can focus on what matters, building your startup. They even have a special offer for TSP listeners. Get 3 months absolutely free if you go to rippling.com/TSP. That's rippling.com/TSP for the Startup Podcast. Over 7,000 global companies like Atlassian, Dovetail, Flow Health, and Quora all use Vanta to manage risk and prove security in real time. Why aren't you? Get $1,000 off Vanta when you go to vanta.com/TSP. That's VANTA.com/TSP for the Startup Podcast to get $1,000 off.
I think people listening now are like, okay, I get it. Imposter syndrome is a real thing. I understand it happens. I understand some of the reasons why it happens. Now, of course, once I'm more successful, once I have more money in the bank, once I have a bigger team, once I have real customers, once I have accolades and the government, the media, academia has blessed me with their grants and their news stories, I shall be alleviated from, soothed from this imposter syndrome. Right, guys? That's what happens next?
It's a simple progression. Yeah.
I've been cured 10 years clean.
Yeah. I want to share a quick story, guys, just to illustrate Chris's point. I remember when I first arrived in Adelaide, because I have an accent and I'm 6'5", everyone wanted me to come and talk to them because I was this weird alien dude. And I was sitting on a panel, and it was quite a young startup audience, young by startup maturity, not necessarily age. This very smart young founder asked a question, and she said, hey, this is one for Mike. And she started her question by saying, hey, Mike, before you were successful, when things were still stressful? And I just stopped her and I was like, sorry, what? Just say that again. Did you say before I was successful and when things were still stressful? So hold on. Do you think it gets less stressful once you hit? And all the panelists were just like, oh my God. Like, you don't even have to finish that question. Like, let's actually unpack this. And at that point, I was like, let me just answer your question by telling you my protocol that I've designed for getting out of a mental low point because of how often it happens. I literally have like a protocol. So this perception that Chris has just absolutely highlighted, that it has an end point based on your external circumstances, I mean, it just doesn't. It just hard doesn't.
Yeah, and sometimes it gets worse. So let's unpack just some of the reasons why it doesn't get better, even though your circumstances, your mental fortitude, your practice has improved, right? First is your expectations grow, your appetite grows along with your success. So if you're doing your job right, your eyes are on the horizon. It's like, I want to get to where that is. That's where the beautiful utopia is. And once you make some progress in that direction, you realize, oh, no, that's the real goal. The next rung up, the next level up. And so when you go, if only I had some people to help me, well, when you have some people to help you, you want to do more in your business. And you're like, well, geez, if I only had 10 more people and we could build this new line of product. And then when you have some customers, you're like, well, if only we could get that next rung of customer and that next scale of success and revenue. And so the first answer to the question of why this doesn't get better is because your appetite keeps growing, the horizon keeps moving away from you, and you're never where you want to be. If you're the kind of person, especially if you're the kind of person that starts a startup, your ambitions are always larger than your reach. And so this is just going to keep following you around wherever you go.
I'd also add, the higher you fly, the harder you fall. So I think one of the things that fuels imposter syndrome, and Mike, you talked about it being about fear, and I agree, it's about fear. The fear of being found out and the fear of being unmasked, and then you fall back to earth. And well, guess what? If you have achieved enormous success, then you are very high up there. You're in rarefied air. And if suddenly your wings melt, you fall back to earth, that shit's going to hurt. And so your fear, in fact, gets greater, not lesser, as you climb. And I think that's something that, again, I used that ladder analogy before. This is the dysfunction in a sense, right? It might have some positive effects, but what you're trying to do is cure a problem with something that's making it worse. It's nearly like having a drug addiction, right? The cure you are seeking is not going to be found by the actions you are taking.
I want to speak very personally to this, actually, guys, just for a moment. The older I get, I see kind of my world lines collapsing, right? Like the fewer time on bat, there's fewer chances I have to make a bet. At the same time, the more my wealth grows, the more I have to lose, to Yaniv's point. And so I absolutely, viscerally experiencing and noticing the increase of fear in my life. Like every day, I'm having to be aware of it and to proactively mitigate it, work against it in a way that, I'm in Silicon Valley right now, visiting my old haunts and my old friends. And I remember walking through these streets, fearless to a degree, stressed and having imposter syndrome in a way, but feeling like I can smash through walls and I'll figure this out. It's a really interesting dichotomy. The more successful I've gotten and the more wealth and the more age, it's like I have more to lose. And now I have my son and my wife to protect. Short of getting better, it gets worse, and viscerally feeling that every day and having to work against that feeling proactively.
We now know the human condition is to have stronger emotions towards fear of loss than excitement of accumulation. Like we fear losing what we have far more than we desire getting what we don't. And it's exactly what Chris has just spoken to there. That's a very real thing. And again, because this is called the Startup Podcast, the practical application of this in your world today, as you're listening to this as a founder, is that when you are governed by fear, you're going to make poorer decisions. When you make poorer decisions, you're going to run a worse off organization. What Chris has just done there is, whether he knows it or not, is he's just modeled the behavior that you guys need to be doing, which is like, just acknowledge what's going on. That's where you begin here. Just going, shit, this is interesting. As I get older, my fear increases.
So let's quickly talk about the ways in which imposter syndrome is holding you back. There's this quote that I see on the internet. I don't know what the original attribution is, but I really love it. And it goes, someone dumber and lazier than you is making 10 times the money because they are too dumb to doubt themselves. So yes, imposter syndrome can be fuel, but it can also hold you back. And we thought we'd just briefly talk about some of the different ways in which it is holding you back. I think one of the big ones is not shooting your shot, pulling your punches, because you are doubting yourself. You are not being as ambitious as you could be, and making, in that sense, Mike, poorer decisions, as you mentioned, because you don't actually have the confidence that you should, based on your own track record and based on what you should know about yourself.
We've spoken a lot about this, but the little point I'll add that maybe hasn't been raised is that I think it's holding you back when you're coming from a place of imposter syndrome. Your energy, your brain cycles, your intelligence is going towards trying to show the world that you're not an imposter, not going towards doing the right things for your business. You're wasting your energy on trying to shift people's reality of things they're not even talking about. No one gives a shit whether you're an imposter or not. You're the only person who cares whether you're an imposter. No one's sitting up at night going, ooh, is Yaniv an imposter or is he not an imposter? I wonder. No one cares. You are the only person that's experiencing your own imposter syndrome. So it's holding you back because the energy you're putting into trying to convince the world that you're not an imposter should be going towards actually making decisions and executing in your startup. So you are diverting energy, which is very finite, to places that you're not going to get a return from.
There's a famous drawing, which I'm sure everybody in the audience has seen by now. There's your comfort zone, and outside of your comfort zone is the little circle labeled success or happiness or, your goals or whatever it is that they label there. It changes. The point being that the thing you want is outside of your comfort zone. So how is imposter syndrome holding you back? It's likely keeping you inside your comfort zone, and it is likely holding you away from mitigating your chances of acquiring the thing that you want that's outside of that comfort zone. It is holding you in a smaller place, a place that is away from your goals. It is forcing you to take less ambitious goals, less ambitious actions. It is forcing you to pull your punches or not make any punches at all. I think what's less obvious, though, is that it's happening in countless ways and countless times every day in these kind of subtle things, as well as the obvious things that you can probably point to right now as you're listening.
There's a really cool book called Essentialism, The Disciplined Pursuit of Less by a guy called Greg McEwen. And he came up with this concept that I love to work with my clients called the essential intent. The thinking behind the essential intent is that when we are unclear as humans, we make up winnable games. Those winnable games are usually very low impact. When we are super clear, we contribute at our highest level. Now, in my opinion, a leader's primary job is to create clarity. We can go, there's a whole episode on that, but it's to create clarity within the organization, right? So what's at risk here with imposter syndrome? When you are living in imposter syndrome, you are unclear. You are not clear. When you are not clear, you are not contributing at your highest level. That's the thread that I see through what Chris has just said, what I've just said, and what Yaniv has just said, is that essentially you will not be contributing at the level that you can because you're stuck in the space of fear.
So I think that's the perfect place to pivot. We've talked about imposter syndrome. It can be fuel, but it can also hold you back and damage your ability to work effectively. And not to mention, it can reduce your enjoyment of your life and of your journey as a founder or as an operator. So let's get a bit more tactical, talk about some solutions or some ways of overcoming or accommodating imposter syndrome in your life and in your work.
Yeah, I think we've touched on a few of these throughout the episode, and it's worth recapping some of the ones we've already touched on and then going deep on some others as well. And Mike, the first one I want to touch on is one you've already mentioned, but I think it's the place to start for anybody listening and for ourselves here on this show, is just acknowledge that it's going on. I think that's the first step, is to acknowledge that it's something you're experiencing. It's something that everybody with any kind of ambition and self-reflection is probably experiencing. And A, that's okay. And B, it's something to be aware of and optimize for. I think that's the first step that we should start with, right?
Yeah, agree. Pretty much any difficult psychological thing has to begin with acknowledging that it's there. I can't stress that enough. It's just like, you are not weak if you have this. In fact, I would flip it and say it is an act of courage, once again, to acknowledge that it exists. It's not a weakness. It's only a weakness if you won't admit it. It becomes an act of courage if you do.
I think there's also, this very tactical thing. In my experience, there's a strong link between imposter syndrome and anxiety. I think I see it in myself. I see it in others. And, definitely if your baseline mental health and physical health are not optimal, then that will make your imposter syndrome worse. So I think there is definitely this just blocking and tackling around lifestyle optimization. That means, getting enough sleep, having a healthy diet, getting enough exercise, and generally just looking after yourself in that way can make a big difference in reducing anxiety and thereby reducing imposter syndrome.
I actually do want to double click on that because those things are called the fundamentals for a reason. I like James Clear's sort of work. So I've got a very simple Google sheet with my habit tracker. Basically, if I've done it, it's green. If I haven't, it's red. The reason I do conditional formatting is so that I can just look at my week and it'll show me in like 1 second. If there's a lot of red, I can guarantee you I'm feeling a lot of imposter syndrome and anxiety. But then it becomes simple. It's like, oh shit, I haven't been sleeping. I haven't been meditating. I drank too much alcohol. I haven't been exercising, whatever my things are. It's really simple then, not easy, but simple to go, shit, let me start with the fundamentals. Let me not try and close my round because my round closing is going to change my bullshit. Your round closing is not going to change your mental health. What's going to change your mental health is stuff that's actually within your control every single fucking day. So if you don't have a habit tracker, create one. I said this earlier and I'll probably say it a few more times today. This concept stems from self-care is not about you. It is about the people and the businesses that rely on you. And something that I observe with a lot of founders is they're like, oh, I wish I could do more exercise. I wish I could get more sleep. But I can't, Mike. I've got too much to do. I've got too much responsibility. I have to flip that in my clients' heads to go, your first responsibility, as you guys said, is you are the asset. You are the thing that builds the thing that builds the thing. If you're not taking care of yourself, you're actually being irresponsible in terms of your duties. So Yaniv almost said that chilled and calmly, but like that is the practical thing that you begin with. Until you're doing that shit, everything else that we're about to talk about probably won't have much of an impact.
Yeah, it's funny. I wrote a book on leadership and I was concerned that it would be like yet another self-help book. And I wrote the line that this book is not a self-help book. It's a helping others book and managing yourself book. It's really what you just said, Mike, which is it's really about helping others, especially as a leader, and empowering your organization and your people. The next thing we want to talk about, and we've talked about this throughout the episode as well, is this idea of telling yourself it's just a story. I have a story about this, about my competency, about who I am, about what I need to be, and whatever delta there is between those two things. It's just a story. And recognizing that pretty much everything you think about the world and yourself is just a story helps you to create a little bit of perspective, helps give you permission to rewrite the story and to not hold it so closely and so emotionally. So I think that's another key tactic for dealing with imposter syndrome.
To make that really practical, because I agree with Chris wholeheartedly. It's just a story and everything's a story. But to take it even further, it's like, it's just a thought and you can't believe your thoughts, good ones and bad ones. But how do we apply that, right? So we might apply that in the following sort of practical way. Something that I found to be very helpful. We spoke a little bit about identity earlier. So to acknowledge your current identity. So my current identity might be, I am an imposter, I'm this, I'm that, this is how I do things, I'm unhealthy, I don't sleep, whatever. There's a really useful exercise to actually sit down and picture the person that doesn't have imposter syndrome, that doesn't struggle with these things, that is the operator, that is the unicorn, and to write down, get really specific, like how does this person show up? What time does this person wake up in the morning? What's this person's daily habit? How does this person deal with imposter syndrome? How does this person make decisions? And actually write it down, get it down there, and then look at yourself and go like, do I want to become that person? Is this the identity I want to create? Because you can create the identity. You have created your current identity. And if you don't believe me on that, just think back to a time when you were really anxious about something that didn't happen. When you were really anxious about that, you felt that as a real thing. There's a biochemical response. You had responses. It was very real. You felt that it was real, and yet it didn't happen. That's proof that like we create the identity. We create the experiences that we have. So why not shift that into something positive? So write that down. How does this person show up? What does this person do? And then actively try and adopt, like, this is how that person would show up. But it's to Chris's point. It's all a story. All of it is a story. Like, we can choose that story.
Well, this is directly connected to what you were saying earlier, Mike, and I wanted to make that connection, which is if it's just a story and maybe that story isn't true, well, write down the story of who is extremely competent. You're extending it now and saying, who is this person who doesn't have imposter syndrome, what they do. But I think both what you said earlier and now go together, which is to say, write down all of the things, the objective characteristics, behaviors, and competencies of this person, and evaluate the delta between who you are and who this imaginary person is. And what you said earlier, Mike, I think is a really great solution, which is you might find the delta isn't that big, or at the very least, it gives you a very actionable set of steps that you can take to close the gap and where to work and how to think about it much more objectively and practically and tactically.
Yeah, we want to change it from this unfightable foe, imposter syndrome, just this thing that is unfightable, to a thing that is actually completely addressable and a thing that we can break down into its parts. You know, if you're a founder, I would like to think that you're a critical thinker and that you can break things down into its parts. Just look at this in the same way. It's just a set of thoughts. And again, I want to remind everybody, we're not trying to get rid of imposter syndrome. I just want to remind people about this. We're not trying to get rid of it. We're trying to change the relationship with it. No imposter syndrome, in my very unqualified opinion, equals arrogance or ignorance. We don't want to get rid of it. But too much imposter syndrome leads you into a state of fear and terrible decision making. So what's the happy balance for you? For me, I like a little bit of it because it pushes me to learn. I read a shitload. I consume a huge amount of knowledge. Honestly, a large reason I do that is because I'm like, shit, I need to make sure I'm sharp. I need to make sure I'm learning. I need to make sure that my imposter syndrome does not get too much. So just a sort of reminder there, guys, that it's like anxiety, right? Like, we don't get rid of anxiety. We change our relationship to it.
The final point we wanted to discuss is that imposter syndrome, people often use it as a threat response that they need to avoid. And I would argue, and I have written about the idea of using imposter syndrome as a rangefinder that helps you find your way towards success. And so if you were listening to this thinking, well, this was a waste of an episode, I don't feel imposter syndrome, and I'm quite comfortable with the work.
Well, you should. Sorry.
Well, part of the argument is you are not maybe being ambitious enough with the kind of work that you're doing. You're not actually pursuing growth. And so there's this saying that, opportunity at first appears like hard work. Opportunity at first appears like anxiety and imposter syndrome as well. The principle I've taken up in my whole life, because I struggle with anxiety, like a pervasive thing, pretty much most days. And what I've taken to realize is I need to follow my anxiety. It's telling me that that's an opportunity, that's something scary and exciting and a place to grow. The trick I often use is I commit and then figure out how. Like, I don't know how I'm going to do that. I'm going to be really anxious, or I don't know if I'll be able to, handle that, or I'm going to have a panic attack before that. And I go, I guess I need to commit real fast before I talk myself out of it. And then I figure out how to do it on the day. And certainly my career at my best, and we're all failures. We all fail a lot on the way to success. I've failed at this miserably many, many times, regularly. But at my best, I am pursuing my imposter syndrome. I'm pursuing that feeling. It's leading me out of my comfort zone to hopefully some growth and success.
Growth and learning hurts. In fact, I think you guys had him on your podcast, but Nir Eyal, he wrote Hooked and Indistractable. I really like his stuff. You wrote a blog post that really shifted it for me. But this concept of like growth, learning, upskilling, It's not comfortable. By definition, you're uncomfortable, right? So these things have become cliches, like feel the fear and do it anyway. There's deep value in that, but it's real. These things of like finding comfort in the discomfort, there's deep wisdom in them. Like we should not be running away from it. Chris, I also have enormous anxiety. For me, it's always triggered by money, which is like the more money I get, the worse it gets, which has absolutely no logical progression. So we don't solve this with logic. We don't solve it with getting more money, but we begin to confront it. And I think there's a critical thing that Chris said there. I'm going to use different words, but imposter syndrome, anxiety, these things are good. They're signals to us to like pay attention to something. They're signals to look at something. That range finding analogy is really cool. So don't try and stop them. Thank them, observe them, and then get on with it. This is simple, but it is not easy. And I think this is where high-performing people also struggle, is they're like, oh, that's so simple. It can't be that simple. It is that simple, but don't confuse simple with easy. It is a lifelong pursuit to actually get it right, but it's not that complicated.
There's an interesting thing here. I talked a little bit about you can use it as fuel or it can become a problem. And Mike, earlier on, you talked about it being kind of like a spectrum, right? It's not either you have imposter syndrome or you don't, you have anxiety or you don't. It is about the role it plays in your life. It's really important to note where it fits in there. You know, I think it's important to have a good life, not to be constantly under anxiety. My understanding of kind of like evolutionary psychology is anxiety, yes, it plays a powerful function. It shouldn't be switched on all the time, right? That's when you get chronic anxiety that is problematic. It's something that should happen as a warning light, as a way of, using it as a rangefinder. Chris, I like that. If you're always anxious, or if you're always feeling that imposter syndrome, that's when you start getting held back. But more to the point, this is not a podcast about living the good life, but ultimately, in a way it is, right? Like you want to incorporate your startup journey into living a life that is good and satisfying for you. And if you are effectively laboring under imposter syndrome the whole time, that is going to be really hard. So I think one other thing that I'd sort of want to destigmatize is also seeing a therapist or getting some coaching, especially from someone who might have some psychology background, to help manage this, right? Therapy doesn't need to be only for people who are severely struggling with their mental health. It can be for anyone who would like to improve their mental health. And so, I think that's something that's really important to consider is, yes, you don't need to get rid of your imposter syndrome, but if it is dominating you, it's like medicine, right? Dose response. Every medicine in excess becomes a poison. And I think when we talk about dealing with imposter syndrome in excess, it stops being that thing that can motivate us, that can push us out of our comfort zone, that can get us to learn, and become something that holds us back and cripples us while making us miserable along the way. And that's the thing that you really want to move away from.
Somebody said something to me like really powerful, and he's talking about anxiety, but I sort of lump anxiety and imposter syndrome into a very similar bucket. And he said, Mike, it's a great servant, but it's a shitty master. And that stuck with me for years. Like when we can harness this to serve us, it's actually very powerful. It's what drives us to be better. When it becomes our master, that's a shit way to live. And I want to echo what Yaniv said. Like anxiety, imposter syndrome, these things are deeply healthy in bursts. If they're pervasive, they become deeply destructive. I think Yaniv said that really eloquently.
I think the other metaphor that I like to use in this conversation is this metaphor of the athlete. Coaches are not just for people with mental health issues. Athletes have coaches to optimize their body and their mind, not because they've got a broken leg, right? You need a coach the same way an athlete does to optimize your health and your mind and your thought process through your startup journey. And also, an athlete doesn't avoid adrenaline. They have the right amount of adrenaline before the starting gun is fired, right? And so to put a bow on all of this, imposter syndrome and anxiety are useful if they're in the right balance, if you're using them to range find, if they're motivating you as fuel. They are unhealthy if they're the master of you, if they're freezing you up with indecision and fear, and they're holding you back from your greatest purpose, from your bravery, and from success. And so I guess the answer to put a button on all of this is about balance and about having the right kind of perspective on the imposter syndrome and following it to the next great opportunity.
Well said. And I think just, guys, if you're listening to this, you are most definitely not alone. Every time I have the balls to stand up in front of a group of people and go, yeah, I've got severe imposter syndrome and anxiety, every time I do that, I'll have at least a handful of people just come up and go, oh my God, I was like you in my head, but I can't believe you said that publicly. You're not alone on this thing. Last thing I want to say about the athlete sort of thing. Someone told me something recently. I just loved it. He was like, a lot of gold medalists were interviewed and they said, how did you feel before you competed? And they all, apparently, said excited, really excited. These psychologists went on to study deeper, and they noticed these top-performing athletes said that they felt excited, but amateur athletes said they felt nervous. Long story short here was this sort of realization that nervousness and excitement are the same emotion. It's the same thing. How we choose to experience them is what differentiates us. You get to choose whether nervousness or excitement, which way it goes.
That is the perfect place to wrap up, Mike. Thanks so much for sharing that. Thanks for sharing your vulnerability and your wisdom. I think this has been a really helpful and soulful episode, so we really appreciate that. If folks want to get more of your stuff, or if they want to get in touch, where can they find you?
Yeah, so I've got a podcast called How to Be Moderately Successful. Otherwise, you can find me on LinkedIn. My name's Mike Scott, or you can go to smbmastery.com.au. So that's like small and mid-sized business, smbmastery.com.au. Thanks for having me, guys. Always a pleasure. You guys are killing it. Thanks for the podcast. You guys are putting out such great content, and I'm honored to be a part of it.
I really appreciate that, Mike.
Thanks so much, Mike. Really appreciate that.
Today's episode of the Startup Podcast was brought to you by Vanta. Vanta automates compliance for SOC 2, ISO 27001, and more, saving you time and money while helping you build customer trust. Plus, you can streamline security reviews by automating questionnaires and demonstrating your security posture with a customer-facing trust center, all powered by Vanta AI. Over 7,000 global companies already use Vanta. Why don't you? Get $1,000 off Vanta when you go to vanta.com/TSP. That's VANTA.com/TSP for the Startup Podcast to get $1,000 off.